Virtually none of us would survive medieval winters. But how did people living in castles survive? The cold was not just an inconvenience, but a silent and deadly enemy that penetrated stone and iron. Survival in a castle in winter became a daily, exhausting battle for every degree of warmth. It was an era when fire was the center of the universe, and a piece of cloth was valued more than a sword. Here, human ingenuity stood up to the icy breath of nature. Watch this video to the end, and you'll learn why thick stone walls were not only a defense, but also a trap, and how an ordinary bed became the warmest and safest bunker in the entire castle. What if I told you that everything you believed about castle feasts was untrue? The Great Hall was not so much a place for celebrations as it was the heart of the castle, its main heating system. This is where all life was concentrated when the cold weather set in. Imagine a modern situation where the heating in an apartment building only works in one room, and all the residents are forced to move there for the winter. A medieval castle functioned on exactly the same principle. All life was concentrated around a single source of heat. If you lived in a medieval castle, you would understand that the choice between comfort and survival was obvious, and personal privacy became a luxury that was inaccessible even to the nobility. The center of this space was a huge hearth, often located right in the middle of the hall. A fire was kept burning in it around the clock, consuming entire logs. It was the main and often the only powerful source of heat for dozens of people. The size of the hearth was impressive. It could be up to 3 or 4 meters wide, allowing huge logs to be burned at the same time. The design was intended for maximum heat transfer, so the fireplace often had a shallow firebox and a wide open space. This provided intense heat radiation in all directions, but required a constant supply of fuel. The smoke from such a fire escaped through a special opening in the roof called a louver. Because of this, the air in the hall was constantly filled with smoke and soot, but the choice between smoke and cold was obvious in favor of the former. The louver was a rather primitive ventilation system. A simple opening in the roof, sometimes covered with a canopy to protect it from rain. In bad weather, it had to be partially closed, which further increased the smoke. Constant smoke inhalation led to chronic breathing problems among the castle's inhabitants, but there was simply no alternative. All the inhabitants of the castle, from the lord to the lowest servant, gathered around the fire. This was not only a social, but also a practical solution. Human bodies gathered in one place generated additional heat, helping to warm the huge room.
So, the wise old sage said, "In the quiet of the morning."
The social hierarchy was even reflected in the seating arrangement around the hearth. The higher the status, the closer to the fire one could sit. The lord and his family occupied the places of honor directly by the fire. The knights and stewards sat a little further away, and the servants were content with the residual heat near the walls. This system was not just a tradition, but a matter of survival in harsh conditions. Many servants and even warriors slept right here on the floor of the Great Hall. They spread their cloaks and mattresses as close as possible to the hearth, which died down at night. It was the easiest way to stay warm while sleeping. Spending the night in the Great Hall became a real art of survival. People lay down in concentric circles around the hearth, with the most experienced knowing the optimal distance from the coals. Too close meant the risk of burns from sparks. Too far meant the risk of freezing. Many slept in their clothes and even in their cloaks, using any available fabric as extra insulation. The stone floors were icy, so they were covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds. Fragrant herbs could be added on top to mask odors. This multi-layered carpet served as important insulation from the cold stone. Fire also had enormous psychological significance. In a world plunged into long winter darkness, the bright flame of the hearth was a symbol of life and hope. It provided light and dispelled the gloom of long evenings. In the medieval mind, fire was associated with divine power and protection from evil. It was believed that the flames drove away not only the cold and darkness, but also evil spirits, which were particularly active during the winter months. Therefore, extinguishing a fire was perceived not simply as a domestic nuisance, but as a real catastrophe threatening the spiritual security of the castle's inhabitants. All daytime activities during the cold season were moved to the Great Hall. Men repaired tools and weapons, while women spun and sewed. Life in the castle was confined to this one warm and smoky space. Keeping the fire going required enormous effort and was one of the main winter tasks. Servants continuously brought wood from the castle's stores. The fire was not allowed to go out for even an hour. Preparing firewood for the winter began in advance in the summer and required the participation of almost all the castle's inhabitants. The wood was stored in special sheds, protected from moisture, as damp wood burned poorly and produced even more smoke. The amount of firewood needed was calculated based on the harshest winters, as a shortage of fuel could be deadly for everyone in the castle. Do you think you could spend the winter in one large, smoky but warm room with dozens of other people? Share your opinion in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about why castles were built this way and not another? We perceive a castle as a cold stone box, but in reality it was a complex system designed for survival. Every element of its construction played a role in combating the cold. Imagine a modern house with energy-efficient technologies, triple-glazed windows, insulated walls, and climate control. A medieval castle was an attempt to achieve a similar effect using only stone, wood, and human ingenuity. If you were a medieval architect, your every decision would be dictated not by aesthetics, but by the harsh necessity of preserving the warmth and lives of the inhabitants in conditions where winter could last 6 months. The main element was incredibly thick stone walls. In addition to their obvious protective function, they had enormous thermal inertia. During the day, the stone slowly absorbed heat from the sun and hearths, and at night it slowly gave it back, smoothing out temperature fluctuations. The walls of the castle could be up to 3 to 4 meters thick at the base, which created a huge thermal mass. The stone worked like a giant heating battery, accumulating heat during the day and slowly releasing it at night. This principle of thermal inertia allowed a relatively stable temperature to be maintained inside the castle, even with significant fluctuations in the outside temperature. The choice of stone for construction was also important for heat conservation. Limestone and sandstone were preferred over granite because they had better insulating properties. Builders even took into account the direction in which the stone was laid, trying to create a minimum number of gaps through which heat could seep. The windows in castles were very small and narrow, not only to protect against arrows. Any window was a source of enormous heat loss. Therefore, their size was reduced to an absolute minimum. Glass was practically non-existent in the early Middle Ages, as it was incredibly expensive. Window openings were covered with wooden shutters, which were tightly closed at night. Sometimes oiled cloth or parchment was used, which allowed some light to pass through, but did not provide good protection from drafts. Oiled cloth was made using a special technique. Linen cloth was impregnated with linseed oil or fat, which made it translucent and partially waterproof. Such improvised windows let in a dim yellowish light, but created a feeling of twilight even on a sunny day. Parchment was made from calf skin, stretched until it was thin and transparent, but it was also an expensive material. Even when glass became more affordable, it remained a luxury. It was inserted into small frames, often removable. For the winter, such precious frames could be removed and the opening boarded up.
It's much warmer in here now.
Indeed it is, my love.
The layout of the castle also took the cold into account. The living quarters of the lord and his family, known as the solar, were often located on the upper floors. Warm air rises, so it was slightly warmer there than below. The solar was a real engineering solution for maximum heat retention. It was located on the south side of the castle to get the most sunlight and heat during the day. Small windows were oriented precisely to the south, and the walls were made especially thick for better insulation. Often the kitchen or other heated rooms were located under the solar so that the heat would rise. Fireplaces built into the walls were a real revolution in heating. They were much more efficient than a central hearth, as they allowed individual rooms to be heated. The chimney drew smoke outside, making the room cleaner and more comfortable. At the same time, heated rooms were kept small. A small space is much easier and faster to heat with a single fireplace. Therefore, the private quarters of the nobility were often quite cramped. The construction of a fireplace required serious engineering knowledge. An incorrectly built chimney could create reverse drafts and fill the room with smoke. Master masons specialized in the construction of fireplaces and passed on the secrets of their craft from father to son. The thickness of the walls around the chimney was calculated so that the stone would heat up and give off heat to the room even after the fire had gone out. Kitchens were often located in separate towers or buildings because of the risk of fire. However, their huge stoves and hearths gave off a lot of heat. The proximity of the living rooms to the kitchen was a big advantage in winter. What other architectural tricks helped preserve precious heat? But what if I told you that the most important insulator in the castle was not stone, but fabric? You've probably never heard of this unique secret. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of medieval comfort, and it is not fire. We are accustomed to thinking of tapestries as works of art, but in a medieval castle, they were first and foremost a vital technology. It was fabrics that made stone bags livable in winter. Imagine a modern home insulation system. Mineral wool, foam, multi-layer structures. Medieval tapestries served the same function as modern insulation, but were made of wool and linen. If you found yourself in an uninsulated stone house in winter, you would understand that without textile insulation, life in a castle would be simply impossible. The stone walls would freeze through, turning the rooms into ice vaults. Heavy wool tapestries were hung on the cold stone walls. They created an air gap between the icy stone and the interior of the room. This gap acted as an effective heat insulator, significantly reducing heat loss. The principle of the air layer was intuitively understood by medieval builders, even though they did not know the scientific basis of heat transfer. The air trapped between the fabric and the wall was heated by the interior of the room and created a buffer zone that prevented the cold from penetrating. The thickness of this layer was usually 10 over 15 centimeters, which provided a significant improvement in thermal insulation. The system for attaching tapestries was a well-thought-out engineering design. Special metal or bone rings were sewn onto the upper edge of the fabric, and iron hooks or wooden pegs were driven into the wall. Some tapestries had wooden slats at the top and bottom to help the fabric hang evenly and prevent it from deforming under its own weight. Imagine the scale. Tapestries covered entire walls, from ceiling to floor. This transformed a cold stone room into a cozy textile box. Only in this way was it possible to stand next to the wall without feeling the icy cold. The main material for these products was wool. Wool fabric has excellent thermal insulation properties. It is dense, heavy, and capable of retaining heat even in the damp atmosphere of the castle. The choice of wool was determined not only by its thermal insulation properties, but also by its ability to retain these qualities in a humid environment. Unlike linen or cotton, wool could absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture while remaining warm to the touch. This was critically important in the castle environment, where humidity was a constant problem due to the stone walls and lack of proper ventilation.
Yes, this wool will keep the chill at bay.
The quality of the wool varied depending on the wealth of the castle owner. The most expensive wool was imported from Flanders and England, where special breeds of sheep with long, thick fleeces were bred. More modest owners used local wool, which was coarser but still provided the necessary insulation. Tapestries cost a fortune and were a sign of high status and wealth. But these were not just luxury expenses, but direct investments in survival and health. The richer the lord, the warmer his castle. In addition to the walls, all openings were draped with fabric. Heavy curtains made of thick wool or velvet were hung over doors and windows. They blocked out the slightest drafts that blew through the huge castles. The design of door curtains was especially important because doors in castles rarely fit tightly against their frames. Wooden doors dried out and warped from moisture and temperature changes, creating gaps through which cold air could penetrate. Heavy curtains created an additional barrier, and sometimes double curtains were used, one directly on the door, another at some distance from it. The famous four-poster bed with a canopy is not a romantic element, but a brilliant invention for sleeping in the cold. Heavy curtains on all four sides created a small enclosed space. The breath of the sleeping person warmed this small space, creating a comfortable microclimate. The floors were also insulated with textiles. On top of a layer of straw and grass, wealthy castle owners laid thick woolen carpets. This was another barrier against the cold coming from the stone foundation. Carpets in medieval castles were not only insulation, but also status symbols. Oriental carpets, brought by merchants from Persia and Byzantium, were particularly highly valued and passed down as family heirlooms. Local carpets were woven from sheep's wool and often decorated with the coats of arms and family symbols of the castle's owners. Caring for all these textiles was a separate and difficult task. In the damp climate of the castle, the fabrics could become damp and spoiled. They had to be periodically dried and cleaned. Ultimately, the fabrics served more than just a utilitarian function. They brought color, texture, and comfort to the harsh and gloomy stone interiors. This made life in the castle not only warmer, but also more visually pleasing. What you are about to learn will change your perception of medieval fashion. Winter fashion in the Middle Ages was dictated solely by practicality. Clothing was a personal fortress, the first and main line of defense against the cold. Imagine the modern equipment of a polar explorer or mountaineer. Multiple layers of technical clothing, each serving a specific function. Medieval people created a similar system, using only natural materials and centuries of survival experience. If you found yourself in a medieval castle in winter wearing modern lightweight clothing, you would quickly realize that every layer of medieval clothing was vital for survival in conditions where indoor temperatures could drop below freezing. The key principle of survival was layering. It was several layers of clothing, not one thick layer, that created air pockets that effectively retained body heat. Everyone, from peasants to kings, dressed according to this principle. The layered clothing system was based on the understanding that air is the best insulator. Each layer trapped a certain amount of air, which was heated by the body and created a thermal barrier. The more layers there were, the more effective the system worked. Medieval people intuitively understood the principles that modern science explains by the laws of heat transfer. The rich and poor differed not so much in the principle of dressing as in the quality of materials. A peasant could wear 3 layers of coarse homespun wool, while a nobleman could wear the same number of layers of fine Flemish fabric. The principle of thermal insulation remained unchanged regardless of social status. The first layer was a linen shirt, or camisole. Linen absorbed moisture well and was pleasant to the body. This layer was important for hygiene and comfort. On top of the undergarment, they wore the main garment, a tunic or cotta made of wool. Wool was the main material of the Middle Ages. It kept you warm even when damp and was very durable. The linen shirt served as modern thermal underwear, wicking moisture away from the skin and creating a comfortable microclimate. Linen had antibacterial properties, which was important in conditions where frequent washing was impossible. The quality of linen varied from coarse peasant cloth to the finest fabrics, which only very wealthy people could afford. The woolen tunic was the heart of the medieval wardrobe. Its cut was designed for maximum warmth, long sleeves, a high collar, and sufficient length to protect the torso. Wool was chosen in various qualities, from coarse sheep's wool for everyday wear to fine merino wool for special occasions. The fabric was often dyed in natural colors, gray, brown, or black, as dyeing significantly increased the cost. Outerwear consisted of cloaks, capes, and surcoats. They were also made of heavy, thick wool. A long and wide cloak was a versatile item that could be wrapped around like a blanket. The wealthiest people could afford fur. Clothes lined or trimmed with beaver, marten, or sable fur were not only a status symbol. Fur provided unmatched protection from the most severe cold. Fur was used to maximum effect. Even small pieces were used to trim collars, cuffs, and hems. Squirrel or rabbit fur was used to line shoes and insulate gloves and hats. The most expensive furs, sable, ermine, and marten, were available only to the highest nobility and were used for ceremonial clothing, which was intended to demonstrate the wealth of the owner. Feet were protected with woolen stockings attached to the belt. Shoes were made of thick leather. For extra warmth, straw or pieces of fabric could be placed inside the boots. The head was the main source of heat loss, so headgear was mandatory. Everyone wore hoods, hats, caps, and scarves. It was unthinkable to be outside in winter with your head uncovered. The system for fastening stockings was a well-thought-out engineering design. Stockings were tied to the belt with leather or fabric straps, which ensured a snug fit and prevented cold air from entering. Women wore long stockings that reached the thighs, while men often wore two separate stockings for each leg. Shoes were made of thick cowhide treated with special tanning agents for water resistance. The soles were made in multiple layers, often with wooden inserts for additional insulation from the cold ground. Wealthy people could afford shoes with wooden blocks, which held their shape better and provided greater comfort. Inside the castle, people did not change into light clothing. Away from the fire, the temperature in the rooms was not much higher than outside. Therefore, many layers of clothing were worn from morning to night, with only the top cloak being removed. How did people keep all these layers of clothing clean? But clothing and warm walls are only half the battle. In the next chapter, you will learn how the diet itself changed in order to survive the long months of cold weather. Survival in winter would have been impossible without careful planning of food supplies. The entire harvest season, from summer to late autumn, was devoted to one goal: preparing enough food to survive the hungry and cold months. Castle storerooms, or lari, were filled to capacity. Imagine a modern family having to stock up on food for 6 months in advance, without a refrigerator, canned goods, or the ability to buy fresh produce at the store. Medieval people lived in exactly these conditions every year. If you were the manager of a medieval castle, you would understand that a mistake in your calculations would mean starvation for hundreds of people. Every decision about how much grain to sow, how many pigs to slaughter, and how many vegetables to pickle was literally a matter of life and death. Planning supplies required complex mathematical calculations and a deep understanding of the needs of people of different ages and occupations. Castle administrators had to take into account not only normal consumption, but also possible losses from rodents, spoilage, and the need to feed additional people, guests, refugees, or mercenaries. Experienced quartermasters knew that it was better to stockpile 20% more than to risk starvation at the end of winter. Food preservation was a key technology. Since refrigerators did not exist, people used methods that had been proven over centuries. Meat and fish were salted, smoked, and dried. Vegetables were fermented and pickled. Fruit was dried. As in any other season, grains were the staple of the diet. Flour was used to bake bread, which made up most of the diet. Thick porridges and soups were also cooked, providing necessary calories and warmth. Preservation techniques had been perfected over centuries of experimentation. Salting meat required knowledge of the exact proportions of salt and curing time. Too little salt meant rapid spoilage. Too much made the product inedible. Smoking was carried out in special smokehouses using certain types of wood, which not only gave the meat flavor, but also additional preservative properties. The process of harvesting grain included not only harvesting, but also proper drying, cleaning, and storage. The grain had to be completely dry before being stored in barns, otherwise it would mold and become poisonous. Barns were built to protect against moisture, rodents, and theft. They were real fortresses for grain. Salted meat and dried fish were the main sources of protein in winter. Huge barrels of salted pork and cod were stored in the castle cellars. Such food had a specific taste, but it allowed people to survive. Fresh vegetables and fruits were unavailable, so they used what could be stored for a long time. Turnips, cabbage, carrots, and parsnips were the basis of winter soups and stews. They were stored in cellars covered with sand. The process of salting meat was laborious and required the participation of the entire castle community. The autumn slaughter of livestock turned into a large-scale event where everyone knew their role. The meat was cut into pieces of a certain size, rubbed with salt, herbs, and spices, and then laid in layers in oak barrels. Fish was often caught specifically for salting, with large-scale fishing expeditions being organized. Root vegetables required special storage conditions. Cellars were dug to a certain depth, where the temperature remained constant throughout the year. Vegetables were laid in layers, sprinkled with sand or peat, which prevented rotting and preserved moisture. Stocks were checked periodically, removing spoiled items so that they would not infect the rest. Dried apples and pears, as well as nuts and honey, served as a source of energy and a rare winter treat. They were harvested in large quantities. They were used to make compotes and added to baked goods. Winter hunting was an important source of food. Groups of hunters went to the surrounding forest for game. Fresh deer or wild boar meat was a real treat on the winter table. Winter hunting was not entertainment, but a necessity of life. Hunting parties were formed from the most experienced trackers and archers who knew the habits of animals and could track prey even in the snow. A successful hunt could provide the castle with fresh meat for several days, as well as valuable skins for making warm clothing. Hot drinks played an important role. People drank warm beer, ale, cider, and of course, wine. Spices were often added to hot wine to make a drink similar to modern mulled wine, which was excellent for warming up. In winter, the castle kitchen became one of the warmest and liveliest corners of the castle. Huge hearths and stoves worked non-stop. The heat from them spread to the adjacent rooms, contributing to the overall heating. The preparation of hot drinks was a real art. Beer was heated with the addition of honey and herbs, creating a nutritious and warming drink. The spices for mulled wine, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, were expensive and used sparingly, but their warming effect was invaluable on cold days. The kitchen truly became the social center of the castle in winter. It was not only a place to prepare food, but also to warm up, socialize, and tell stories. The cooking fires burned around the clock, providing not only food preparation, but also additional heat for the neighboring rooms. The winter diet was high in calories, fat, and salt. It may seem unhealthy by modern standards, but for people engaged in hard physical labor in constant cold conditions, such food was absolutely necessary. The high-calorie content of the winter diet was due to the body's increased energy needs during the cold season. Fats provided long-term energy and helped maintain body temperature, while salt was necessary for preserving food and replenishing losses during physical work. People of that time instinctively understood what food would help them survive in harsh conditions. Guess how much wood was needed to heat a castle for just one day? The roaring flames in the fireplaces and hearths did not come out of thin air. They were the result of the titanic, year-round work of an entire army of people. The amount of wood needed to heat a single castle was enormous. In one winter, an average castle could burn wood from dozens of hectares of forest. Securing fuel was a strategic task. Firewood harvesting began in the spring and continued throughout the summer. Lumberjacks felled trees, cut off branches, and sawed trunks into logs. Then all this had to be taken out of the forest and delivered to the castle. A critically important stage was the drying or aging of the wood. Freshly cut or green, wood burns poorly, producing a lot of smoke and little heat. Therefore, the firewood had to lie and dry under a canopy for at least several months. Huge areas were required to store firewood. Special woodsheds and wood piles were built in and around castles. Fuel supplies were as important as food supplies. All this work required a huge number of workers. A chain of lumberjacks, carters, sawyers, and stackers worked tirelessly. It was an invisible but vital front of work. The owner of the castle had to have rights to extensive forest lands. Control over the forest was no less important than control over the arable land. Access to fuel was one of the levers of power. Even when the firewood was delivered and dried, the work was not over. Inside the castle, servants carried heavy armfuls of firewood from the storerooms to the numerous fireplaces from morning till night. It was endless and exhausting work. In addition to wood, other types of fuel were used in some regions. In marshy areas, peat was actively burned, and for smithies and other craft needs, charcoal was used, which provided a higher burning temperature. What happened when supplies ran low? But the heat from the fire was not the only way to keep warm. In the next chapter, we will look at how the daily routine and life itself within the castle walls changed with the arrival of winter. Winter completely changed the rhythm of life in a medieval castle. The feverish activity of the warm season was replaced by a slow and measured existence. The castle seemed to hibernate along with the surrounding nature. Imagine modern life without electricity, central heating, and round-the-clock access to goods and services. Medieval winter was precisely such a period of forced slowdown when the natural cycles of nature dictated their terms to humans. If you lived in a medieval castle, you would understand that life in winter was governed by completely different laws, not by people's ambitions and plans, but by the relentless rhythm of short days and long nights. This transition from active summer to passive winter was not just a seasonal adaptation, but a radical restructuring of the entire way of life. People of that time did not resist this change, but accepted it as an inevitable part of the annual cycle. Winter required a different way of thinking, a different organization of time, and a different attitude toward one's own capabilities. Daylight hours were very short, and artificial lighting was expensive and dim. Therefore, all work was strictly tied to daylight hours. People rose at dawn and ceased active work at dusk. Most outdoor work ceased completely. The fields lay under snow, and construction came to a standstill until spring. All life moved inside the castle walls. Winter days lasted only 7-8 hours, which drastically limited the possibilities for any activity. Candles and oil lamps gave off such dim light that only the simplest work could be done by them. Wax candles were expensive and used sparingly. Tallow candles gave off more smoke than light, and lamp oil also cost a lot of money. The daily routine was completely dependent on the solar cycle. People rose before dawn to make the most of the precious hours of daylight. By evening, when the sun set, most work stopped, and people gathered around the hearth for dinner and conversation. The main focus was on work that could be done indoors. Men repaired armor, weapons, horse tack, and agricultural tools. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and sewed clothes. Winter was a time for artisans. In a calm environment, they could focus on delicate and painstaking work. Jewelers, wood carvers, and bone carvers created their finest pieces during these dark months. Craftsmanship took on a special character in winter. It was a time for creating high-quality items that required patience and skill. Blacksmiths reforged and repaired tools, while armorers carefully polished blades and checked every detail of the armor. Women were engaged in weaving, creating not only practical clothing, but also decorative fabrics for the castle. Winter crafts were often done collectively, which helped people share knowledge and improve their skills. Masters passed on the secrets of their craft to their students, talked about new ways of working, and shared their experience. This time was especially valuable for teaching traditional skills to the younger generation.
As I show you the technique.
I understand, thank you.
For the nobility, winter was a time of leisure. Long evenings were spent playing chess, backgammon, or dice. It was also customary to listen to minstrels who entertained the castle's inhabitants with songs and ballads. The social aspect was very important. Since everyone was confined to a limited space, it was a time for socializing and strengthening bonds. Long winter evenings by the fire were conducive to the sharing of stories, legends, and news. The intellectual life of the castle reached its peak in winter. Educated people read books, discussed philosophical and theological issues, and studied history and law. Chess was not just a game, but was considered an important exercise for the mind, developing the strategic thinking necessary for war and governance. Ministers played a key role in the cultural life of the castle in winter. They not only entertained, but also served as living newspapers, recounting events in other lands and passing on news and rumors. Their songs and ballads preserved historical memory, passing on stories of great heroes and important events from generation to generation. Military training also changed in nature. Instead of large-scale maneuvers in open terrain, knights and soldiers honed their fencing skills in enclosed courtyards or halls. More attention was paid to theory and strategy. The castle became an autonomous, isolated world. The gates could be closed for weeks due to snowfall. Travel became rare and dangerous, and the castle lived its own, closed life. Winter military training required adaptation to limited space. Sword, dagger, and other melee weapon techniques were practiced indoors. Particular attention was paid to the study of tactics and strategy. Knights and commanders analyzed past battles, planned future campaigns, and discussed new military techniques. The castle was almost completely isolated in winter. Snow drifts made the roads impassable, and the cold made travel extremely dangerous. Contact with the outside world was maintained only through the most experienced messengers, who risked their lives to traverse the winter roads. This isolation created a special atmosphere of a closed community, where everyone depended on each other and all were bound by a common destiny. This period of forced inactivity was important for restoring strength. It gave people in the land the rest they needed. Everyone saved up their energy before the start of a new cycle of hard work that came with the arrival of spring. Access to water was vital all year round, but winter posed particular challenges. Rivers, ponds, and even the moats around the castle were covered with a thick layer of ice. Obtaining water became a difficult task. The main source of water in the castle was the well. Located inside the walls, it was protected from enemies, and the water in it, coming from deep layers of the earth, rarely froze. The well was the #1 strategic object. However, drawing water from the well in the frost was hard and unpleasant work. Buckets and ropes froze, and hands became numb from the cold. Servants had to do this work many times a day. Another source was cisterns for collecting rainwater. But in winter, they could also freeze. In addition, they were not replenished in snowy weather. The waste disposal system also worked differently in winter. The frozen ground made it impossible to dig new garbage pits. Waste simply accumulated, freezing into large piles. The main element of the sewage system was the wardrobe, or outhouse. It was a small room hanging over the outer wall of the castle. All waste fell down into a moat or to the foot of the wall. In winter, this process had its own peculiarities. The waste froze, forming entire ice cascades against the castle walls. The spring thaw turned this into a serious problem. Kitchen and other household waste was thrown into a specially designated area. In winter, this rubbish heap, or midden, froze through. At least this got rid of unpleasant odors during the cold season. Keeping the castle clean was already a difficult task, and in winter, it was even more so. In addition to the usual dirt, there was soot from the constantly burning hearths. It settled on the walls, furniture, and fabrics. However, the cold had one undeniable advantage. Low temperatures significantly slowed down the decay process. This helped to curb the spread of some problems associated with unsanitary conditions. In the Middle Ages, winter was considered the dead season for warfare. Harsh weather conditions made it virtually impossible to organize large military campaigns. Armies preferred to wait out the cold in their garrisons. Defensive moats filled with water froze over. This was a serious problem, as the ice turned the moat into a convenient bridge for attackers. Defenders had to regularly chip away at the ice near the walls. Service on the walls and in the towers became a real ordeal. The sentries suffered from the piercing wind, snow, and frost. They had to remain vigilant in inhuman conditions. To protect the guards from the weather, small wooden huts were sometimes built on the walls. Braziers with coals could be set up nearby so that the sentries could warm themselves a little. But this was not available in all castles. Due to the severe cold, the length of duty on the walls was reduced. The guards changed more often than in summer. This was necessary to avoid serious frostbite. Snow cover had its pros and cons for defense. On the one hand, any approaching army was visible from afar on the white snow. On the other hand, snowfalls greatly reduced visibility and made it difficult for patrols to move around. Supplying a besieging army in winter was a logistical nightmare. Delivering food and fodder along snow-covered roads was almost impossible. Therefore, most commanders did not even consider a siege in winter. Nevertheless, the castle garrison always had to be on alert. Food and firewood supplies were its main guarantee of safety in case of a sudden winter siege. The castle became a besieged island, even without an enemy at the gates. The cold also affected weapons. Bowstrings could become brittle in the frost. Moving heavy siege engines across snow and ice was extremely difficult. Thus, the most reliable defender of the castle in winter was not the garrison, but the weather itself. Cold and snow were a more formidable obstacle to any army than the highest walls and deepest moats. The castle was as secure as possible. One of the main problems of winter was the almost complete darkness. Short, gray days were followed by endless, long nights. The struggle for light was as important as the struggle for warmth. Artificial lighting was expensive and inefficient. Its main sources were the hearth fire, torches, and candles. Each had its drawbacks. Torches made of tarred tow on a stick gave off a lot of light, but they smoked and posed a serious fire hazard. They were mainly used to light corridors, stairways, and courtyards. People tried not to use them in living quarters. Candles were the best alternative. The highest quality and most expensive candles were made from beeswax. They burned brightly, evenly, and produced almost no smoke. But only very wealthy people and the church could afford such a luxury. Most of the castle's inhabitants used tallow candles. They were made from animal fat and were much cheaper than wax candles. However, such candles burned dimly, smoked heavily, and emitted an unpleasant odor. Due to the high cost of lighting, it was used very sparingly. Most people's lives were tied to sunlight. They got up at dawn and went to bed shortly after sunset so as not to burn precious candles. The brightest place in the castle in the evenings was the Great Hall. The huge fire in the central hearth provided enough light for conversation and simple work. This was another reason why everyone gathered there. Darkness also shaped the cultural life of the castle. Long winter evenings were a time for oral traditions. People gathered around the fire to listen to storytellers who recounted ancient legends, heroic sagas, and entertaining stories. The psychological impact of prolonged darkness was enormous. People lived in semi-darkness for months. Therefore, the return of the sun and the lengthening of daylight hours in spring was a cause for universal joy and great celebrations. This constant lack of light shows how different the medieval world was from ours. We live in a world flooded with artificial light 24 hours a day. To a person of the Middle Ages, such a reality would seem like a real miracle. As we can see, a medieval castle was not just a fortress, but a complex system for survival. Every element, from the thickness of the walls to the material of the curtains, served one main purpose: to survive the long, cold winter. It was a daily struggle in which the main weapons were not steel, but foresight, hard work, and ingenuity. Warmth was the result not of a single decision, but of a whole complex of measures: architecture, textiles, proper nutrition, and the enormous work of preparing fuel. Life revolved around the fire, and human warmth became as valuable a resource as firewood and food. The harsh reality of winter life had nothing in common with the romantic images from books and movies. We talked about how people survived in cold castles. What other topics from medieval life would you like us to cover? Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next episode.